All right, there you go.
Hello, friends. Welcome to this 24th webinar on the Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. We did a volume check before we started and got it in the ballpark, so it should be better than last time. But if you find that my volume is too high or too low relative to everyone else, BL and people who are reading, because the idea is that they're all at about the same volume. We are all at about the same volume, and then you can turn your own computer volume up or down, or phone volume, and we should all be pretty much in the same ballpark. Um, okay. As you know by now, this webinar series is available on makara.us under the subheadings Moria Federation Webinars, then Webinar Series in Progress, as shown here. Previous episodes of this and the Secret Doctrine series are also available on YouTube. Just do a search for Francis Donald Secret Teachings or Secret Doctrine. Okay, I'd like to start today's session with an extended excerpt from Externalization of the Hierarchy by Alice Bailey. As we go through, we'll discuss this excerpt page by page. So can we get a reader for this first page?
Sure, I'll start that out for you. The lines of cleavage between the animal, instinctual nature and some form of desire, embryonic aspiration, steadily grew during the Atlantean times, and this early civilization began to demonstrate its own note and to set new standards of material comfort and of selfish control on an increasingly large scale as the urban existence developed. It is perhaps difficult for us to visualize a world as densely populated than Anne is the modern,
It is now.
the modern world, but so it was. In those far-off times, the only people who had any true measure of intelligence were the disciples and initiates. They guided and guarded infant humanity, much as modern parents guide and guard their children. And as the state assumes responsibility for the welfare of the nation. The hierarchy was, in those days, present upon the earth as the priest kings, and they acted as focal points of attractive energy, drawing to themselves those in whom the more intangible values were slowly assuming a vague control, thus making the lines of cleavage between materialism and spirituality still more clear and definite. We must remember that the spirituality of that time was of a very different quality from that which now goes under that name. It was in the nature of an aspiration towards a sensed hereafter, for a satisfying beauty and for emotional completion. There was no thought, as we know thought, in this attitude, but only a reaching out after a sensed unattainable and for that which was desirable. This was fostered in the people by the hierarchy through the gift of various inventions and by the use of the instinctual masses of men in building great and beautiful cities and stupendous structures, the remnants of which persist until today.
Thanks, BL. Any thoughts or questions about this first page? Of note here is the fact that the hierarchy was physically present, physically in incarnation upon the earth as priest kings, acting as, quote, focal points of attractive energy. And Atlantean spirituality manifested as an aspiration towards a sensed hereafter for a satisfying beauty and for emotional completion. For intelligence as we know it was only developed among aspirants and initiates. Okay, next page. A reader, please.
Carrie, can you read that for us, please?
This was done under the expert guidance of the initiates and adepts who employed their knowledge of the nature of matter and energy to produce much that today man is gropingly endeavoring to discover and make possible. All that the modern processes of civilization have made possible, and much more than that which today comes under the name of scientific discovery, were known in old Atlantis. But they were not developed by men themselves, but given to them as a free gift, much as people today give to a child beautiful and wonderful things, which the child uses and enjoys, but which he does not understand in any way. Great and beautiful cities, full of temples and great buildings, of which the Chaldean and Babylonian remains are the degenerate remnants, and the modern skyscraper, the child, were everywhere to be found. Most of our modern scientific knowledge was possessed by these priest kings and constituted in the eyes of the masses a form of wonderful magic. Sanitation, hygiene, means of transportation, and air machines were developed of a very high order. These were not the result, however, of man's achievement, but gifts from the hierarchy, developed or constructed under a wise guidance. There was command of air and water, because the guides of the race knew how to control and master the forces of nature and of the elements. But none of it was the result of human understanding, knowledge, or effort. The minds of men were undeveloped and not adequate to such a task, any more than is the mind of a little child.
Thank you, Carrie. Any thoughts or questions about this passage? Astonishing that, quote, all that the modern process of civilization have made possible, and much more than that, which today comes under the name of scientific discovery, were known in old Atlantis. It suggests to me that at least certain members of the present hierarchy are aware of levels of science that have yet to be discovered by humanity. Also of note is that certain surviving Chaldean and Babylonian structures are the quote unquote degenerate remnants of Atlantis. We can read this in a couple of ways. Either these remains are literally Atlantean remains, suggesting that at some point in Atlantean history, its lands included ancient Chaldean and Babylonian, or that these ruins reflect the later and thus degenerate influence of Atlantean architecture. I tend to think the former. Finally, there was a command of air and water based on a mastery of the forces of nature and of the elements. Again, not by the fourth root race types, but by initiates. No real surprise that they had command of water, but something astonishing that there were flying machines in those far off days.
Francis,
Yeah.
you have a hand up, Karen. I'll get to you in just a minute. And then Efrosini says, perhaps our current scientific discoveries are recollections of the gifts of Atlantis.
That's a really interesting idea. Uh, in our little DK group today, we were talking. It's from esoteric psychology too, and one of the means by which a person's sense of being guided is awakened is through unconscious memory of their own previous lifetimes. And so certainly, among the great scientists, we may have just what you suggest. Anyone else?
Carrie says I'm louder than you are, so I must need to adjust mine. Yes, Karen has her hand up. Go ahead, Karen.
Yes. Is it discussed in the books, or have you discussed this previously, the purpose for the masters giving these gifts to humanity when they really weren't ready for them or really didn't understand them?
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting question. No, he doesn't. He doesn't go into that subject, but we could speculate. First thing we have to remember is that Atlantis lasted for millions of years and only sort of lost control of its destiny and of its growth curve towards the end. The last 20,000 years, the Black Brotherhood, the Dark Brothers were able to take control. But for literally millions of years before that, it worked. My guess, and it would only be a guess, Karen, is that it acted as a mental stimulation for them to work with these gifts of science, and to involve themselves with them, even though they weren't in any way ready to determine their nature. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gabrielle says, I wonder what the purpose of these gifts to the childlike fourth root race was.
Yeah. Yeah, you really do have to wonder. First of all, I'm not sure you could come up with a single purpose for all the types of gifts. There, some things would be kind of obvious, like sanitation. If you're going to have a city like the one pictured here, then advanced methods of sanitation would be very desirable for propelling the root race forward. As to air travel, well, that's something altogether different, isn't it? And it's hard to say why they felt that it was the best way forward for this root race. Yeah, we could only speculate, but I think you'd have to do it, with each type of gift. Yes. Anybody else?
Yes, Yvonne has her hand up. Go ahead, Yvonne.
In Steiner's books, he talks about these airships, how they propelled them. And it's really interesting. Some were manned by 2 people, some by 8. And they had a lever to make it rise horizontally, sort of like there's a Harrier. The Marines have a Harrier that goes straight up in the air.
Right.
Like that, and forward and backward, and to turn it each way. And he tells how they controlled the things. But I think, that makes sense that they had these things. It required mental stimulation because the hierarchy didn't. If everyone had one in like a car in the garage, they were taught how to use them.
Yeah.
And, it would stimulate their mental capacity. So, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
Stuff describes the airships in some of his books.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm, at this point looking for all things Atlantis. So I'll take a look and see what I can find with him. It didn't occur to me to look there. Especially interesting in terms of this air travel is that it was done through mastering the forces of nature and the elements. And, you could call our current air travel sort of metaphorically mastering the forces, but I think here it suggests more of a magical mastering of the forces. And I think that a race of humans would actually be closer to these magical means by not having developed the very separative intellect, which is, it's really mind-boggling to us to even imagine that. But it's all speculative. But yeah. Anyone else?
Yes, Gabriella says, do you think there may come a higher turn of the spiral in our time of including mind's development, of bringing through portions of the plan upon the earth, including what seems like wonders? seems like the Deva kingdom was significantly involved.
Yeah, I think to answer your I think certainly the Deva kingdom comes much closer when the intellect is out of the way. It's part of the forces of nature. In fact, you could even make an argument that they represent, in fact, the embodiment of the forces of nature. When you think that elemental substance is actually little lives that make up our physical substance, then from that point of view, it's all, the Deva controlled elementals. And as terms of the other part, will there come a time when the wonders will be reintroduced? I think, you know, towards the end of this quote, he says that the hierarchy very wisely withdrew any direct control of physical plane activity. And I think it's at the physical plane level that it's going to be up to us. Short of stopping the destruction of the species, in which case there were forces that stepped in at Atlantean times, and we would hope there would be forces that would step in, if we reach that place. But short of that, I think the physical part of it's going to be our development. Now, as soon as etheric vision comes, which DK says will happen in early Aquarian times, everything changes, because then you will have inventors seeing, through clairvoyant recognition, seeing their designs. And so you'll have a great rapid unfoldment of what we now call technology, but in all fields that is not yet extant. That's just one way that quote wonders could come to us, right? But I think we'll be mentally responsible and cognizant of those wonders when they occur, unlike in Atlantean times. Anyone else?
Nope, that's all the questions in hands right now.
Okay. So, next up, can we get a reader, please?
Yes, Karen G., can you read that for us, please?
The cleavage between the two groups, the one expressing the forces of materialism and the other the energy of light, grew gradually wider until towards the close of the Atlantean age, it was so wide and the lines of demarcation between the two schools of life and thought were so clear that a crisis was precipitated in the then civilized world of which the present conflict is a definite effect.
Meaning World War II.
Let us also hope that it constitutes a climax which will never again occur. This took place, the great war between the Lords of Form and the Lords of Being, or between the forces of matter and the Great White Lodge. A careful study of Volume 2 of The Secret Doctrine will prove enlightening to students if they will study with particular care pages 275 to 466. To our understanding, this account may seem vague and obscure, but the issues at the time were clear. The forces of light triumphed because the hierarchy was forced to intervene potently and with the aid of certain great lives extraneous to our planetary life. They brought the Atlantean civilization to an abrupt end after a long period of chaos and disaster. This took place through the medium of a culminating catastrophe, which wiped hundreds of thousands of human beings off the face of the earth. This historical event has been preserved for us in the universal legend of the Great Flood. Those who survived are symbolically spoken of in the Bible as those who were saved in Noah's Ark. And in the ancient writings, it is expressed in the following terms. Like as a dragon snake uncoils slowly its body, so the sons of men, led on by the sons of wisdom, open their folds and spreading out like a running stream of sweet waters. Many of the faint-hearted among them perished on their way, but most were saved.
Thank you, Karen. Any thoughts or questions? We'll be taking a look at some of the material in this almost 200-page section of the Secret Doctrine later in our study of Atlantis.
Francis, sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got a hand up. Go ahead, Samuel. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, my question is, Jeffrey Asher, who was a member of the Theosophical Society, in one of his lectures, he talked about the group souls that left the moon planet, and he said that the mention of the ark in the Christian Bible must refer to, I mean, in a symbolic sense, it's actually souls that were leaving from that world and coming into our world. So it was not anything physical. And then in this article, according to the reading, it says, if I understand it correctly, it's kind of alluding to those who survive the Atlantean destruction. Am I right?
I don't know that quote about that extraterrestrial ark. Of course, the ark is a very useful metaphor for any type of vehicle, and so it's DK doesn't talk much about extraterrestrial or other planets migrations in his work. So I actually probably can't really answer your question as to whether those people were the survivors of Atlantis. He does talk about the nature of those survivors in an upcoming quote, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Anyone
And
else?
then, yes, we've got a couple of comments. Gabrielle says, this is all so mind-blowing, and I'm with her.
Yeah, that's why I started, this webinar with this quote, because DK brings something to the table that really no other author can. So I thought it'd be useful to start off that way. Yeah, go ahead.
And then Efrosini says, as in psychological life, the trauma of the past is repeated until you resolve it. It seems that the trauma created to humanity in the Atlantean era was repeated in World War II in order to be resolved with the predominance of spiritual forces. This involuntary repetition of trauma is called in psychoanalysis repetition compulsion.
Well, that's very interesting. But it also represents a definite orchestrated attack by the Dark Brotherhood in both cases. And at the time, there was no saving of the root race, whereas with World War II, of course, there was. But that's the event that DK most often associates with both wars, is the Dark Brotherhood's effort to stop spiritual progress. But I like that idea of what you said, that there's also an internal cyclic effort to expunge yourself of the darkness through war. Another thing DK said is that World War II could have happened. We could have resolved it on etheric levels, but not enough disciples got involved in that inner process in order to make that happen. Anyone else?
That's it for now.
Okay.
Oops.
Yeah.
That was it for now. And Veronica says, atavism? I'm sorry. Let me unmute her so she can explain that.
You said it right, Pia. It's atavism. It's actually, Efrosini knows better. It's the kind of the way you behave that has to do with the past and with your relatives and in some ways in past lives.
Yeah. It's a recorded phenomenon among occultists, that idea that you're unconsciously directed in your current life to not directly repeat, but to be influenced by not only your own past lives, but association with the groups that you were associated with, not to mention the cultures and civilizations. We're going to be getting into Edgar Cayce a little bit in this. And he said that over half of the people that he did readings for, and he did like 22,000 readings, over half of those people had had incarnations in Atlantis. So it's pretty extraordinary, the connection that we have, you know. Of course, more would be incarnating in as U.S. citizens than some parts of the world. And Casey was a U.S. citizen, so it might be more U.S. citizens than other parts of the world, but still an impressive statistic. Yes, anyone else?
Yes, Yvonne says that William Scott Elliott and A.P. Sennett wrote books on Atlantis.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, Senate made a few pithy comments about Atlantis. He wrote Esoteric Buddhism, and in that book there's a section on Atlantis. Anyone else?
Yes, Gabriella says, have we not all been incarnated in Atlantis?
Well, according to Casey, at least half of us. It's possible that your purpose didn't coincide with the development of Atlantean. It's hard to imagine how that could be, since there really was the race for gaining emotional sensitivity and eventually becoming emotionally polarized, which was at that time actually a positive development. Now it's considered recessive, and largely because the Atlanteans weren't able to finish their work, their last 3 root races. Okay, anyone else?
I just wanted to say I read something recently in the Dyna books where DK was talking to BSD, but he told him that he had a problem similar to that of BSW. And he basically said that they were ignoring their astrality, that they were ignoring their psychic natures, because they felt that they were inferior. And DK's point was there's a time and a place, because those are the reflection of Booty. And so it's important that you bring it up. But in this particular passage, the moral to the story is he said that in Atlantean times, the what we consider to be the second initiation now was actually their 5th initiation, control of the astral plane. So, a 5th initiation would be a master for them,
Right.
because that was the nature of that root race.
Right.
So I thought that was quite interesting.
He also says that the quality of a master of wisdom in those days was nothing like the quality of a master of wisdom now. Every one of the initiations has has advanced enormously, just the nature of them. And that could be just what you said. It could be that really what that fifth initiation, which we call the master, would have really done is mastered the emotional level. I know that the Christ took the third initiation in Atlantis, and he was the first to do so. So in belonging to our humanity, so that shows the relative level of even initiates of that time. If he was the highest. Now that's like a current third initiation, meaning mental awareness. And that would have been unheard of in Atlantis.
Right. I was thinking in terms of, we're told that the first and second initiation aren't really the cosmic initiations, that our third initiation is the first
Yeah.
Initiation. And I believe there was probably a similar analogy in the fourth root race in Atlantean times, and what they would have considered their first four initiations are probably below our threshold
Yeah.
at our current advancement. So
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, they were literally their spirituality was the development of the intellect. I mean, what we now take for granted as at least among one third of humanity with a developed intellect, that was what disciples were working with. Not, I mean, and we'll come across it if we haven't already, that spirituality at that time is not at all what spirituality is today. So yeah, it's really interesting. And probably we wouldn't even be able to recognize the issues involved, that you would need to overcome in order to take an initiation, because for us now, they would just be part of living. It'd be what you would get growing up as, basic education today. Anyone else?
Okay. Yes, we have a number of comments, and Yvonne's got her hand up, but let me read a couple of comments first. Anne Veronica said, could some come from the moon chain?
Well, I would say probably so, but certainly most of the guides of the race would have come from the moon chain. Christ was the first human born in the human, not a part of the moon chain, but having individualized in Lemuria, he was the first to take the third initiation. So you would assume that all the hierarchy was made up of moon chain initiates, and from other places besides that. In terms of moon chain being part of the fourth root race, I just don't know the answer to that. I think that would be a pretty slow moving group if that was the case, but possibly, there's a very much a connection energetically between moon chain energy and Atlantean energy, but just who and how they took advantage of that link, I couldn't answer. Yeah, anyone else?
Okay, Efrosini says, can you tell us who are the sons of men mentioned in the ancient commentary?
Yeah, sons of men are generally the current root race. It's the sons of men. This he mentioned here. Look down here. He says, so the sons of men led by the sons of wisdom open the folds. So these sons of men would have been the remnants of the Atlantean root race, which would have been the seed bearers of the fifth or Aryan root race. And they'd be led by the sons of wisdom, who would be the initiates of that time. Anyone else?
Yes, and hold on just a second, Yvonne, I'm getting to you. Vivienne says, in the gospel, Jesus calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee. Perhaps a reference to this?
To me, that's always meant mastery of the emotional plane and being, and also what he says here in the last, where is it here? Yeah, so the master of the forces of nature and the elements, right? This is something you learn at one of the higher initiations, and since even Jesus was a fourth initiate, probably at that time, I don't know exactly when in his recapitulation of the initiations that calming of the seas took place, but he would have brought forth his ability to master the forces of nature, but it would be a metaphor for mastering your own emotional nature. It would have been a teaching to those involved, the disciples that he was with, for that. Yeah, anyone else?
Yeah, one more comment before we get to Yvonne, and that is Gabriel says, what effect on us in the present fifth root race is the unfinished work of the fourth? Was it unfinished emotional work?
Yeah, mostly. It would be the influences would be, legion. There would be so many things involved in this. The level of our, well, just the state of the union of the human reality would be influenced by the fact that the Atlantean root race was not able to complete itself. But one very definite and specific thing is that 2/3 of the population of the human race now is, which is the fifth root race, is still emotionally polarized because we're still having to play catch up from the fact that Atlantean fourth root race was unable to finish the work assigned to them. Okay, anyone else?
Yes, Yvonne, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted, Michael Robbins commented that he thought that Atlantis, a lot of young souls incarnated or individualized on Atlantis, and that is the population today that is probably the 2/3 of the emotionally polarized people that you're talking about. That
Yeah,
are,
it could be. It could be. There's been 3 waves of individualization that are mentioned by DK. My guess is that there's others, but the Moon Chain group, then the Lemurian, which is the first human wave, and that was at the fourth cusp of the third and fourth subrace of that Lemurian race. And then in Atlantis, during Atlantis, there was a group individualized, right? So just that fact would have a very regressing effect on humanity as a whole. I mean, if you're crossing the barrier from the animal world into the human kingdom and you become a citizen of Atlantis, you can see that would be that would bring down the level of advancement of the entire group of Atlanteans. But we're not given numbers or percentages. But yeah, I think your idea that they may represent the emotionally polarized types is has merit. Anyone else? But I'd also say that doesn't mean that if you individualize in Lemuria that you're automatically mentally polarized now, because there are those that advance extremely fast as the Christ did, and those who don't and advance very slowly. And there's something inherent in our individuality that determines that. Yeah. Anyone else?
Nope, that's it for now.
Okay. So let's see, we were here. So last time we discussed the Atlantean War that took place between the forces of light and the forces of materialism. New to me is the fact that it was necessary to call on, quote, certain great lives extraneous to our planetary life to ensure victory for the hierarchy. Wouldn't you like to know the rest of that story? We have to keep in mind that this war took place during the densest point and thus the most susceptible to evil that has and will take place during the entire Earth scheme, to wit, the fourth subrace of the fourth race, remembering the fourth is always the lowest point in terms of the materiality. So we have the fourth subrace of the fourth race of the fourth globe of the fourth chain of the fourth scheme from the sun. That's about as dense as it gets.
That's
So,
it.
what? I'm sorry, did somebody interrupt? No, it's okay. So that, of course, the densest point of materiality is the most vulnerable point from the point of view of the Dark Brotherhood taking an opportunity, right? And finally, I've never come across the dragon snake as a metaphor for the sons of men. Possibly the uncoiling refers to the fact that humanity spread out across the globe following Atlantis' destruction. For me, this dragon snake of sweet waters, what a term, huh? Seems like a watery version of the phoenix, which is, appropriate to the fifth root race because it's a fiery re-becoming. But in this time, the dragon snake of the sweet waters would have been that great being. Okay, on to the last page of this
And
quote.
and Veronica says caduceus uncoiling.
Yeah, caduceus, caduceus represents a particular matrix of energy that has to do with the bringing to life of the central channel, as in the spinal cord, but not only the spinal cord, through the cooperation of the pairs of opposites. So it's a very particular type of snake. Yeah. All right. Can we get a reader for this, please?
Yvonne, can you read that for us, please?
A close study of the tale as given in The Secret Doctrine will reveal the state of immature development from the angle of our modern standards and of the basically emotional and physical focus of the humanity of the period. It will show also man's magical ability to subdue and control the subhuman kingdoms and the elemental forces of the planet. These are two angles which have been but little studied. Emphasis has, however, been rightly placed upon divine interference and intervention. This succeeded in salvaging an ethically sound minority. The word spiritual would not yet apply except relatively, and in destroying those who were wrongly focused or oriented, and therefore dedicated to the life of material aspiration and perception. This nucleus, which was saved, formed the basis of our present root race, the Aryan. The whole theme of the Old Testament is built around the development and growth of this nucleus. Symbolically speaking, the inhabitants of the ark and their descendants and the Jewish race stand for the salvaged remnant of humanity, salvaged in spite of themselves and in face of stupendous difficulties by the Great White Lodge. 2 points warrant attention here. The first and least important from the standpoint of the soul is the disappearance off the earth of practically all signs of the wonderful Atlantean civilization, except for those few archaeological treasures which intrigue and interest modern research workers, plus those dim memories of ancient scientific achievement, which lead the modern student to investigation and invention, as Karen mentioned, and which incite him to discovery and the production of what we call the triumphs of modern science. The second point is that for the good of humanity, the hierarchy withdrew into the background, leaving man to find his own way out of the mirage and illusion of materialism in right ways, and eventually to bring an end to the ancient cleavages. War must be brought to its final consummation and expression with a view to its final discarding as a means of arriving at desired ends from externalization of the hierarchy.
Thank you. Any thoughts or questions about this passage? Important points here covered are: 1, Atlanteans' emotional polarity. 2, the now lost magical ability to subdue and control the subhuman kingdoms and elemental forces of the planet. I say now lost, I mean lost among humanity as a whole. 3, the fact that an ethically sound minority from the fourth root race formed the nucleus of our present Aryan root race, which were symbolically the inhabitants of the Ark and their descendants, as well as the Jewish race. And finally, the fact that the hierarchy withdrew from active control, leaving humanity to take responsibility for its own progress. Any final thoughts or questions on this astonishing excerpt from Externalization of the Hierarchy? You can see why it would be a part of that book, right? Since literally the hierarchy was externalized during Atlantean times.
And Veronica wants to know what archaeological treasures.
Well, one that I can think of is this extraordinary crystal skull that some of you may have heard of. It's supposedly the skull of the reproduction of the skull of an 18-year-old woman. Some current forensic expert was able to determine that. I think now it resides in Colorado Springs somewhere, but it is associated with definite magical power, and it was supposedly discovered in a Mayan temple. So that's one. He mentions the, what did he call it? The degenerate remnants from Chaldea and Babylon, and which, you know, who knows just exactly what that refers to. And I'm sure there are others, you know, that have yet to be determined or are known and not known to me. I've always been amazed by these Olmec heads, these huge heads that are found and not a part of any definite known culture like the Mayan, you know, or the Aztec. But, you know, as to whether they themselves were. Now, there's all kinds of influence, but in terms of archaeological artifacts, those are the ones I can think of.
Okay, you've got a question from Greg, so let me unmute him. Go ahead, Greg, and then we have more comments. So,
I was thinking about the description of the Jewish race as the remnants of the Atlanteans, but also this concept that in spite of themselves, but the inhabitants of the Ark and their descendants in the Jewish race. I mean, I'm not trying to be anti-Semitic or anything. I just was wondering, I mean, because when we look at the later teachings, they talk about the Jewish race when DK discusses the races overall, but the Jewish race is, I mean, it may be some of the core, but there are other racial relationships too. And so I just was wondering about that. I didn't want to get stuck in any kind of a race thing. I mean, in terms of the race that we understood, like
it's sensitive topic, but the best way to avoid a you know, any whiff of racial bias is to understand that we've all been Jews. We either are Jews now, have been Jews, will be Jews in the future. That it's not, you know, that races are part of the experience of developing as human beings. You know, to be involved in the different what we call races. You know, DK tends to mostly use the term as it is related to root races and subraces, right? So there's a definite distinction then. That said, DK definitely addresses what he calls the Jewish problem, which is a which is a it's basically a clinging to the third principle, an adherence to the form aspect. And there's quite a bit of teaching on that. I don't think now is the time to get into that. Also, I'm not really prepared to say much more than I just said about it. But yeah, that's what I can say at this point, right?
Well, that's kind of what I would say too. I just had to kind of verify it because I guess then we have to look at the Jewish race as a descriptive measure of the remnants of that Atlantean root race, the ones that were chosen to survive, but we're all, since we've all probably incarnated as Jews at some point, that we are part of that same race, that whether we call it modern Judaism or not, but I think
Right.
I get that.
Yeah. Now, those who were chosen to survive would be more correctly determined by those who followed the path of light, or more specifically, those that didn't follow the Dark Brotherhood. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
those
that would
would
make
those
sense.
would have been the ones that where it was really necessary to stop that influence from going forward because it was in process of taking over the entire human population, right?
Yeah,
When it
that
was,
would make sense. Thank you for hearing me.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. This term salvaged in spite of themselves. Uh, um, what that means to me is that in spite of the problems posed to the hierarchy by the fact that the what he's calling the Jewish race, um, which is really a cultural group, that their adherence to material beliefs, you know, and HPB talks, you know, it's one of her favorite rants, which is the material orientation of the Jewish, of the symbols and metaphors in Judaism. In fact, the in one of those interesting synchronicities, that's one of the things we'll be looking at next time in the Secret Doctrine, just because it happens to have come up in the material. Okay, anyone else?
Oh, yes. Carrie says, except in the above, does DK make any other reference to the landing of the animals aboard the ark?
I don't know. In terms of, you know, I haven't I haven't done a word search that would bring that specific subject to the fore. Nothing that I've read indicates the nature of the animals that went aboard the ark. So, you know, you could see, practically speaking. First of all, you have to understand the nature of the ark. It's represents all that was saved. So all those vessels, which would include airships, evidently, that went forth over a long period of time, by the way, out of that central continent of Atlantis. All those who migrated out before its destruction and would have carried the seeds of the new, and that would have included not only humankind but animals, not just two of each. However, that's strictly metaphorical, Anyone else?
Maria says, reference the archaeological treasures, and I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this name. She says, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, perhaps?
By what you just said, I'm not familiar with that. Go back. Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. Can you describe it, Maria, further?
Let me see if I can unmute her. Okay, can you talk now, Maria?
Fairly recent discovery. What was that? Wasn't it a temple of sorts with this extraordinary archaeology?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like some of the kind of recent discoveries. Like it's like a temple that was. The construction is amazing. Like the size of the stones and the way they were worked.
Right.
And they were. I think the theory is that they were buried intentionally, and they don't know quite well why they did that. And there are other discoveries that similar to that one. So
right. Yeah. You can't carbon date stone, and so all they do is guess based on anything that references a similar culture. And this, I think, I remember one of the effects is that it made them push back the development of humanity's abilities. But this is along the traditional archaeological model, you know. So yeah, it certainly could be a remnant. I'd have to look at it closer to see if there was certain aspects of what they found that would, really would suggest Atlantis. But there's probably pieces sitting in museums, that are just don't fit any category that were miraculously brought to, the new world, which would mean all the worlds around the Atlantean worlds, and were saved from destruction. But you have to remember, when you're looking at 4 million years ago, there's not going to be any baskets, right? It's going to pretty much be stone and mineral objects. Nothing else would have survived, and very little of that. Anyone else?
Yes, before I get to Efrosini's comment, Catherine put a link in there to the smithsonianmagazine.com for Göbekli Tepe, the world's first temple. And I just emailed that to you, Francis.
Great. I'll take a look.
Okay, and then Efrosini says, could the tendency, and by the way, Catherine sent that to everybody. So if anybody's interested in that, you should find that in your chat. Let me see. Efrosini says, could the tendency of the hierarchy offer gifts of civilization was judged as a wrong practice that led to the destruction of Atlantis? And that is why it was withdrawn. And only through intense effort and initiation does one gain hierarchical inspirations.
Well, I think that's a worthy hypothesis. But you have to remember, it worked for a very long time, for millions of years, before it stopped working, And also, most of the destruction was done as a result of rampant psychism, which was able to basically take over whole swaths of the population. There was a particularly dominant evil one, whose name I won't repeat, who was able to literally possess crowds of people. Not unlike if you watch a Nazi speech or Hitler speaking, you can feel the potency and the grip of the magnetic grip on the mass consciousness of, those watching. Well, when you figure that intellect was only known among disciples, you could see how easy it would be for such a one to spread its influence, right? So it's mostly that. Now they may have carried out some of their destruction, as in terms of the war, through those technical advances. But I think the root of it was in this form of evil psychism. Anyone else?
And yeah, we've got a couple of hands, but just one more comment from Efrosini. She says, I do not understand well what ark means in salvaged remnants of humanity. Since Atlantis and sustainable life in Earth were destroyed, and we know that there is no death, but rebirths and immortality of soul, what does ark and saved people mean?
Okay. Yeah. Ark, as you see it here in this painting, is a symbol, for physical plane saving of the, so that man could procreate, because without that seed, the entire process of coming back into incarnation would have to be recreated. And so literally at a physical level, there was a small group that were saved, what he calls here an ethically sound minority. And those were esoterically saved by being told to migrate out. That migration took on the collective mythology of the ark, right? So there was no, as far as I know, I mean, even if there was a single ark, like there's supposedly an ark on the top of a mountain in Turkey that landed there, but that would have just been one of many vessels over, by the way, a long period of time that migrated out. That whole movement would have been called, but fall under the metaphor of the ark, right? Very much as he says right here, right? What does he say? Ark here. Yeah, inhabitants of the ark and their descendants stand for the salvage remnant of humanity. So, yeah, that's probably all I have to say about that. All I can say is it's necessary to preserve the physical line. Otherwise, it has to be recreated. Even if, each of us reincarnates, it's our capacity to reincarnate is made possible by the physical existence of humanity on the planet. So that's why it was deemed necessary. Go ahead.
Yvonne, you had a question?
Yes, I was reading in Helena Rourke, her letters today, and she was saying that at the time of Atlantis, we have to remember, she's talking about all the temples that were built. They still had control of the elementals, and they had the elementals build the temples. And I was thinking about a remnant of Atlantis. How about the Sphinx and the pyramids?
Yeah.
I was thinking, yeah. The
I
Sphinx.
think that knowledge of being able to control the forces of nature carried over. We'll be reading specifically about building that, so we'll hold off on that until then. It came through Edgar Casey, the dates and other information about that. Anyone else?
Yes, Samuel has his hand up, but before we get to that, Catherine says, thank you for that question. This theme of what survives and the symbol of the ark is so essential. Okay, Samuel, you have your hand up. You have a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
It has to do with the mention of the Jews. I just wanted to see whether there is a parallelism between the Jewish people and the ancient Hinduism, because there are few accounts here and there that talk about Hinduism being the oldest religion, followed by I think one other, and then before the Egyptian. But basically, I think they just mentioned Hinduism and the Egyptian, and then looking at Indian text, but just by itself, you get to realize that it seems to be you can get further back to how old the Hinduism as a religion and as a race uh, has been around. So, and then there's another account where they talk about Abraham and
Right.
the name Abraham, how it actually originated from the side of the Hindu people. So
Yeah.
Abraham meaning he's not a Brahma, something like that. So I just want to know whether you have any idea on how do you is there a parallelism between in terms of age, in terms of who been around longer now
Well,
that uh-huh.
Okay, first of all, HPB tells us that the seed of the Aryan race was begun by adepts that were extant, first of all, in India through Hinduism, but also through Egypt and Chaldea. So those are the three roots, but the oldest of those was the Brahmanical Hindus. That was the seed of the ancient wisdom was brought through by the Brahmanical Hindus, right? And HPB talks about this root document called the QT, from which all the current day spiritual doctrines come from, and we'll be reading about that. So I won't rob my later part of the webinar to just now on terms of that document. But to answer your question, the the Jewish race certainly goes back to those early times, but the Jewish faith and the symbols used, just like in Christianity, are extremely derivative. You can find for instance, the temple, the what is it? What's it called? What's the word I want? It's not synagogue. It's what's the name of their temple? Tabernacle. Is that it? I think so. Anyway, it was exactly patterned on Egyptian dimensions, and there's archaeological indications of that fact, right? And in much of the teachings, they can all be found in earlier spiritual documents and faiths, right? Sources is the word I'm looking for. So I don't know if that helped, but that's what I know about it. Okay, anyone else?
That goes in exactly to what Gregory says. He says it's important to acknowledge or recognize that almost all of the Abrahamic religious originating races are representative of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism.
Well, just take the word Abraham. I mean, Brahman. It's like meaning the first or the beginning, Brahman. The entity who espouses that quality. And it's Abraham. So, it's pretty clear. I mean, it's not even veiled. It's just right there. Right. So, yeah.
And he goes on to say the key that is involved is, can we find an even more ancient relationship to the Hindu religion teachings and the Abrahamic religious origins?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, there was a root teaching called the QKIU-TI that is supposedly everything came from that, and that was originally recorded in Sinzar, and which was then translated out of into all these various um, um, forms, you know, you could say, and we'll be reading about that. So, okay, you know, the doctrine, capital D, is routinely given out and withdrawn, and it's completely based on humanity's readiness to receive. And, you know, the parts of the doctrine that are given out are in accordance with that principle, you know. So at any given time, the sources available are representative of an intention by the hierarchy to give out what's needed. So, you know, to me, the most extraordinary thing that's been given out is the works of Alice Bailey in recent times, you know, which are the works of the Master Dual Ghul. And that's the most recent version of that one doctrine, you know, the one articulated doctrine. Okay.
Francis, Greg asked, can you send us a copy of the teaching via a link or some other form we can use to relate these religions?
I'm not sure what the request is. A link.
I think it's in relation to the QT or whatever it was you just mentioned.
Yeah. Let's see.
Will you spell that again?
Wait, I think, okay, this is just my memory, and I think it's KIU-TI, but I may be missing a letter there. I think that's it. But, you know, if you just hold on, it's going to be coming up. I mean, in this and the secret doctrine, it comes forward. So it will be available that way.
Okay, and then Christine says, Abraham, human or hybrid, I maintain, and then Hebrew Anunnaki.
Okay. I'll just leave that. I don't know really what to do, how to comment on that. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? That's it for now. Okay.
For now, just take a breath and wait a second.
Take a breath away. Okay. I'm going to take this opportunity to take us back to the Secret Teachings text. I wanted to do a preamble of the webinar, but it looks like it's going to be most of the webinar. That's all right, because it's tremendous material. That quote from Externalization of the Hierarchy, really amazing stuff. And that type of source material is absolutely unavailable from any other source. So I think it was really it was time well spent. So let's start by rereading the paragraph that we were in the middle of analyzing last time. So could we get a reader for this? As always, this big page on the left represents where we are in the big book, page 34, the Secret Teachings of All Ages, and then this standout highlight represents the paragraph that is reproduced here. Okay.
Greg, can you read that for us, please?
Yeah, sure. From a careful consideration of Plato's description of Atlantis, it is evident that the story should not be regarded as wholly historical, but rather as both allegorical and historical. Origen, Porphyry, Proclus, Iamblichus, and Syrianus realized that the story concealed a profound philosophical mystery. And I got to move the chat. Okay, a profound philosophical mystery, but they disagreed as to the actual interpretation. Plato's Atlantis symbolizes the threefold nature of both the universe and the human body. The 10 kings of Atlantis are the tetractys, or numbers, which are born as 5 pairs of opposites. And then it says, parentheses, consult Theon of Smyrna for the Pythagorean doctrine of opposites. The numbers 1 to 10 rule every creature, and the numbers in turn are under the control of the monad, or one, the eldest among them.
Okay, thank you, Greg. So we left off our analysis last month with, quote, the 10 kings of Atlantis are the tetractys, or numbers, which are born as 5 pairs of opposites. The number 10 was greatly influential in the creation of Atlantis, represented by those 10 kings. An influence that has its root in the philosophy of the tetractys, which is graphically represented, and we looked at this slide last time briefly, by the snake atop the omphalos, which is that origin of the earth. That's what the omphalos stands for, the navel of the earth. So representing, in both cases, the initiating one and the receptive egg, or 0, which MPH defines as being the entire formula of material generation. Like the serpent, the dot at the top of the tetractys, or in the center, your choice, is the fecundating agent for the 9, which are in their turn the outer extension of the 1. Thus, the 1, the serpent, plus the 0, the egg, form the number 10, which numerologically reduces to 1. 1 plus 0 is 1. Both are unity. Unity in essence, that's the 1, and unity in extension, the 10. The sum total as potential and the sum total in manifestation. But there is also a noumenal or causal unity from which the first singularity issues forth, which in Atlantean times demonstrated as Poseidon, representing the Atlantean logoic unity, from which comes Atlas, Poseidon's earthly counterpart, followed by a further extension into form represented by the 10 kings, which over countless generations people all of Atlantis. Atlas is the unifying agent of all this, for he embodies Atlantis through the metaphor of Mount Atlas, the axis mundi of the 4th root race. This is the meaning behind the myth of Atlas holding up the world. For in those days, he literally did. So, this is the masculine embodiment of the tetractys. The feminine embodiment demonstrates through the trinity of Poseidon, Cleito, and Atlas, symbolized by the 3 large islands, and Atlas's 7 daughters, which are analogous to the 7 Atlantean subraces, represented by the 7 small islands. So at this point, I'd like to take a closer look at MPH's esoteric interpretation of the mythology of Poseidon and Cleito. It's really a brilliant development that he made many, many years after he wrote the Secret Teachings. So, could we get a reader to start us off?
Andrea, can you read that for us, please?
Mute yourself because they just...
Do you want me to read?
Please.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No problem.
The Neoplatonists agreed that the story of Atlantis should be accepted as both historical and allegorical, but they were at variance as to the true interpretation. Certain opinions of these learned men form the basis of my, MPH's, interpretation. The Orphic theology, which is the true foundation of the Greek philosophical system, is an exceedingly intricate and profound subject. The keys to the allegorical Atlantis story are to be found in the ritualism and fantasy of the Orphic rites. The Orphics divided the universe, visible and invisible, into three parts. The Orphic initiate, Pythagoras, named these parts in descending order: the supreme world, the superior world, and the inferior world. The supreme world was the abode of pure truth and consisted of one single substance and essence, the divine nature itself, formless and unbegotten, eternal and incorruptible. The superior world was the dwelling place of the principles, the gods, the qualities and manifestations of the divine nature. Here dwelt the causes of all material phenomena, invisible in their own natures, but visible through their manifestations. The lower or inferior world was the plane of corruptible forms, the sphere of bodies and of such tangible natures as having beginning and end. The inferior world frequently is referred to as the sphere of generation. The three worlds in the terminology of the Orphics are referred to as the bodies of the blessed gods. Heaven, or Uranos, ruled the first, or supreme world. Kronos, the aged god of the crooked tooth, devourer of his own progeny, ruled the superior world. Zeus, the demiurgos, or material creator, from his ethereal throne, controlled the destiny of the inferior world.
Thank you. Well read. Okay, next up. Reader.
More? Oh.
Okay, Martha, can you read that, please?
Sure. For our purpose, it should be especially remembered that Zeus is the third person of the great triad of gods, Lord of the physical universe, regent of matter in all its forms and conditions, and the chief of the order of gods which rule the planets, stars, constellations, and elements. The ancients recognized three conditions of matter. The highest they termed airy or intellectual. The second they termed watery or spermatic. And the third they termed earthy or corporeal. These three conditions of matter were therefore properly termed the three natures of Zeus. They personified the three parts of matter, regarding them as the bodies and abodes of the principal mundane gods. The airy or intellectual region they allotted to Zeus under the form of Jupiter Ammon. The watery or spermatic they allotted to Zeus Poseidon, or Zeus, Lord of the humid ethers. And the earthy or corporeal part they allotted to Zeus Hades, or the subterranean Zeus, Lord of the underworld.
Thank you, Martha. Okay, and next up.
Okay, Carrie, can you read that, please?
In this way, Zeus, the airy intellectual part of the material world, dominated the three conditions or states of matter, fashioning them into the cosmos through the powers conferred upon him by the supermundane gods, who abode in the superior sphere far beyond the cognition of mortals. The material creation of worlds, or more correctly their material generation or manifestation, therefore, occurred on three planes sequentially. There was first the world idea, which arose in the mind of Zeus on the plane of airy intellect. It is therefore explained that Zeus first contemplated the abyss or outer space, matter, and envisioned the pattern of the worlds.
Okay, and thank you, Carrie. A reader for this? Finish up.
This pattern of intellectual conception of creation then descended into the watery or spermatic level, where it became what Plato called the archetype. The creative, forming power passed from Zeus to Poseidon. That is, the newly formed universe came under the laws of the etheric, humid, germinating sphere. At this stage, we enter upon the actual beginning of the Atlantean allegory.
Thanks, Biel. Any thoughts or questions? Let's take a closer look at the central watery plain ruled by Poseidon, since that's specifically relates to Atlantis. Just as Zeus Ammon, Zeus Poseidon, and Zeus Hades, just as Zeus manifests in a threefold manner as Zeus Ammon, Zeus Poseidon, and Zeus Hades, Poseidon's threefold etheric nature expresses itself as the higher etheric personified in the myth by Evenor. That's the first male akin to Adam. And the lower etheric by his wife, Leucippe, which is akin to Eve. And the union of these two by their daughter, Cleito. As in chemistry, at the moment of their union, the higher and lower, Cleito's mother and father, disappear. They're combined in the beingness of the unified ether, which is symbolized by Cleito. Then Poseidon, as a personification of etheric, humid, germinating sphere, mates with Cleito, thus impressing his purpose on the higher substantive etheric, resulting in Atlas, the personification of Atlantis, and the first among 5 pairs of opposites, known in the Gnostic liturgy as syzygies. Notice that if you flip the generative upper triangle and expand it to surround the 6-pointed star with a point at the center, you have the tetractys. The ethical fall, symbolized by Atlantis' invasion of Greece, resulted in the literal fall and purificatory sinking of Atlantis. But it could also be argued that this final stage simply represents the bottom of the evolutionary arc, or physical incarnation. At any rate, we have a root race that was initiated and terminated in the subjective and literal watery sphere. Could you turn that mic off, please, Bill?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, any thoughts or questions on anything having to do with this chart? Okay, in honor of the 10 founders, the 10 kings born from Poseidon and Cleito, the number 10 was used to determine pretty much all aspects of the design of Atlantis' central city, which may have been called Poseidonus. We know this from Plato's precise recording of the measurements used by the original Atlantean builders. This use of the number 10 has been exhaustively explored by John Mitchell in a chapter dedicated to the subject from his book, How the World is Made. Mitchell believes that the measurements of the capital of Atlantis, given in 600-foot increments called stadion, were created by Plato as a geometrical allegory with philosophical implications. In truth, we don't know whether these measurements were given to Solon by the priest of Sais, and eventually passed down to Plato, or created by Plato. In either case, Plato suggests that the numerical basis on which the city was designed preordained Atlantis' destruction. The root of the flaw, Plato suggests, was in using the number 10 rather than the universal 12 for the basis of the city's design. Okay, a great circular outer wall was constructed around the city at a distance of 50 stadia. Remember, each stadion was 600 feet, which is about 5.5 miles, 50 stadia, from the outer watery ring of the city proper, resulting in a total area of precisely 100,000 acres. At the central point of this great outer circle stood the hub of the Temple of Poseidon, where Cleito gave birth to the 5 pairs of twins that would become the princes or kings of Atlantis. At this point, according to Plato's measurements, the ancient builders placed a 300-foot wide, 10-pointed star, 1 point for each prince. From this initial figure, a naturally occurring series of geometric forms were to determine every aspect of the city's measurement and consequent construction, from center to periphery, all the way out to the perimeter of the city. So, the next stage in this series of outward extensions was determined by a group of 10 pentagons, as illustrated on the right, which in turn define the bottom 2 lines of 10 pentacles, again illustrated on the right. The circle that bisects these 10 pentacles became the perimeter of the city's central shrine. Within that circle, as indicated by the highlighted area on the left, and forming part of that shrine wall, was the perimeter of the Temple of Poseidon, whose width of 300 feet was determined by the initial 10-pointed star. The temple's length was 1 stadion, or 600 feet, a massive temple indeed. The next stage takes the design out to the walls of the Acropolis, and as indicated by the central black circle on the left. The distance from the center of the island to the outer Acropolis walls was determined by a second ring of 30 pentacles, which you can see forming the outer ring of the figure on the right. Mitchell describes this figure, quote, "The 10 decagons within the ring of 30 pentacles, symbolizing the first 10 kings of Atlantis together with their queens, have been drawn in different ways to illustrate some of the many geometric possibilities." A close-up of 3 of these shrines to the 10 kings is shown at the upper right. Okay, the next stage represents a further stadion extension outward to the perimeter of the central island as shown here. At this point, John Mitchell, who had hand-drawn the geometry in each extension, handed over the creation of further extensions to Alan Brown, who generated them on a computer. On the left is the central island, on the right, the entire city. Here's the city's geometry next to a map of the city using Plato's measurements. And here, the two are overlaid, proving, to the extent that such things can be proven, that Plato's measurements are a key to the geometry used, either by the Atlanteans themselves or by Plato, as the basis for a geometrically conceived city and or a geometrically based philosophical allegory, all based on the golden mean. At the end of his chapter on Atlantis, Mitchell provides us with the key to the geometry used to determine the perimeter of the Acropolis, revealing that each stage follows the Fibonacci sequence, the golden mean, as shown in the highlighted part of the series on the bottom right. So I don't expect that you kept up all the way, absolutely. The takeaway is that these forms, these stars and pentacles and pentagons, were the means of extending the perimeter from that root temple at the very center where Cleito and Poseidon gave birth to the 10 kings, all the way out to the perimeter of the city. Pretty cool to me. Okay, back to the text and the end of the paragraph, which references 10 as an extension of the unity of the monad. In Atlantis, according to MPH's later writings, this monad, as earlier mentioned, was Poseidon personified by Atlas. Okay, next up.
Okay, hold it.
Okay.
Efrosini has a couple comments. First, she says, or she asks, if Atlantis had not been destroyed early, would the number of 10 kings have been higher?
Well, the 10 kings were the very beginning. That was, 3-4 million years before this destruction of Atlantis. And but Plato makes a philosophical point that 10 is a number of perfected humanity rather than a cosmic number, which is 12. For instance, just as an example of that, the solar plexus has 10 petals and the heart center has 12. And that shift from one to the other is from the personal to the impersonal. So he sees a flaw in using the 10. Of course, how much of this is Plato teaching his students, through this grand allegory, and how much of it really was the way Atlantis unfolded is, we just can't know that. So, yeah.
And then she goes on to say, maybe Atlas refers to the Manu of the Atlantis race, the Shusha Manu.
What about him? Or maybe he was that? Is that what
Yeah, maybe Atlas refers to the Manu of the Atlantis race.
Yeah, you could say he was the Abraham, of the fourth root race. He was also represented the axis mundi, as we'll discover. He was the central pole around which Atlas was able to exist. He was the means by which Poseidon materialized Atlantis, you could say. And so, yeah, that would be the purpose of a Manu. So, yeah, I think that's a good hypothesis that Atlantis was the kind of seed Manu of that root race.
And then Gregory's got his hand up. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Greg. Greg, you had a question?
Is it a possibility that these also form some of the basic core teachings of the Masonic teachings and earlier, or is there any relationship?
Yeah, it's a good question. Since Masonry has its origin in the hierarchy, in the Blue Lodge of the hierarchy, which has its origins in the lodge on Sirius, this takes the lodge out of any temporal existence with the fifth root race. And therefore, some form of Masonry would certainly have existed in Atlantean times. In other words, some reflection of the Blue Lodge of the hierarchy, which in itself would have been quite different, in Atlantean times, would have had a manifestation among the Atlanteans. Yeah. But, just what that might have looked like and, whether it followed anything like the same form is impossible to know. Anyone else? Okay. Next up, could we get a reader, please?
Greg, can you read that for us, please?
Yeah, can you hear me okay still?
Yes.
Okay. With the trident scepter of Poseidon, these kings held sway over the inhabitants of the 7 small and 3 great islands comprising Atlantis. Philosophically, the 10 islands symbolize the triune powers of the superior deity and the 7 regents who bow before his eternal throne. If Atlantis be considered as the archetypal sphere, then its immersion signifies the descent of rational, organized consciousness into the illusionary, impermanent realm of irrational mortal ignorance. Both the sinking of Atlantis and the biblical story of the fall of man signify spiritual involution, a prerequisite to conscious evolution. That's a great statement. That's really cool.
Yeah, good. Any thoughts or questions about this? Okay, the trident is a rod of power, not unlike the threefold caduceus. HPB tells us that its esoteric meaning is the, quote, 3 in 1. And as such, is the instrument and weapon of Shiva, first ray Lord. In the Greek tradition, it was fabricated by first ray Vulcan and is always associated with Poseidon. MPH expands on the philosophical meaning of the 10 islands. Again, we turn to Atlantis and interpretation. Can we get a reader for this, please?
Karen, can you read that for us, please?
In the quotation from Marcellus, it is stated that the Atlantic continent, considered of 7 islands sacred to Persephone, to Proserpine, and 3 immense continents, one sacred to Jupiter, the second to Pluto, and the third between these 2 to Neptune. The 3 great continents represent the 3 parts of the inferior world of Pythagoras: the airy, the watery, and the earthy. The central continent between the extremes, the abode of Poseidon, is the location of the watery empire Atlantis. The 7 smaller islands, sacred to Proserpine, are the planets which surrounded the body of the sun in the solar system, or the 7 continents which emerged sequentially from the imperishable island with its zones of land and water in the evolution of life itself. Atlantis and interpretation.
Thank you, Karen. Thoughts or questions? We just examined the inferior world of Pythagoras, made up of the airy, watery, and earthly realms, while studying this chart. Any other questions about this? Okay, the term archetypal sphere suggests the causal plane on which the Atlantean root race was conceived, formulated, and designed, and where its purpose and potential was determined, a level on which, quote, rational organized consciousness reigns. In the phrase, the illusionary impermanent realm of irrational mortal ignorance, we have 4 descriptors of the realm of human endeavor, specifically of the lower mental states of unawareness, which are prerequisite to conscious evolution. Okay, we are there, folks. We're at the end of our time. We'll start here next time. Moving right along. It's quite a subject, isn't it? We'll be with it for at least a couple of more sessions, even though in the book it's just all of this column and then a little bit on the next page. But it references a lot of material, so we'll be taking a close look. Yeah, do you want to go ahead and give dates out?
Okay, the next Secret Teaching of All Ages is going to be on the 5th of September at 7 p.m. GMT. But before that, we have the next Secret doctrine, which is going to be on the 15th of August at 7 p.m.
So I think we're at regular 2-week intervals, aren't we? Let's see, certainly.
Yeah, the first and third Sunday of each month.
Okay, yeah. But I think the 15th to the 5th is a 3-week interval. But
Well, it's because there's an extra Sunday in August. There's 5 Sundays in August instead of just 4.
So
That's the reason. So,
between those last two, yeah.
right.
But 2 weeks till the next. Okay.
Right. And then you've got a hand up. So
okay.
you wanted to say something, Trudy? Well, she's muted. I've asked her to unmute, but I don't see her saying anything. So there she goes. There you go.
No, I just wanted to say that. Thank you very much for your wonderful, and thank you very much for that wonderful Poseidon picture to start with.
Oh, good. Yeah.
That was absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, it's a news item. You could pull it up easily. Everybody, she's referencing this.
I went and looked. Oh my God, they're stunning.
It's absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, that's incredible. That this is unretouched, because you're not going to get, a BBC photographer taking this into Photoshop. You'd have no reason to. But also notice the hand here with its fingers. I mean, even almost articulated. It's quite extraordinary. And the bird, for reference to size, shows you what a huge wave this really was. Of course, the lighthouse does too. But yeah, it's quite an amazing thing, isn't it? Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
Out of this world.
Out of this world, isn't it? Yet right in it. So
yeah.
Okay, you all, it's a real privilege.
Thank you.
It's I very much enjoy it, and its purpose to this for me. So I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, until
Thank
next.
you, Francis. And
thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, Francis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Francis, and everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, Gary.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.